I think at some point it became clear what was going to happen. It became kind of clear where the cap was going. I've been using the current projection that I've had. The reality was my projection for at least 2 months now, 3 months. So I think teams are as prepared as they were going to be, and they've been negotiating with free agents, in the last 2-3 weeks.
This is the Sports Business Classroom audio experience. If you recognize the voice, let me put a name with it. I'm Bo Estes, a host on NBA TV and an announcer on NBA.com. I'm one of the instructors at SBC. Welcome to the show. Now, breaking into the world of sports can seem daunting, but if you're looking for a leg up, you've come to the right place. Each week, we talk to top-notch figures all across the industry to bring you lessons and advice to learn from. Thanks for spending some time with us today, and let the experience begin. Sports Business Classroom is an immersive sports business training and educational experience unlike any other. In addition to this podcast, SBC provides numerous opportunities for those looking to break into and grow in the world of professional sports. One opportunity that I'd specifically like to tell you about today is the Cba Mastery Course with none other than Larry Coon. Larry is undoubtedly, and I can't stress this enough, undoubtedly the leading expert on the collective bargaining agreement, and he has been teaching the materials to teams, agents, media, and students for over 20 years as an expert on the topic. Now, for the first time ever, he has an online course containing all of his material available for purchase to the general public. So, if you're looking to work in an NBA front office one day, this information is imperative to know. And by completing this course, you can not only learn the material, but you can become an expert in it as well. Larry Coon's Cba Mastery Course is presented by SBC and is a surefire way to put yourself in a position to land a killer job in the business of basketball. Registration is now open, so visit sportsbusinessclassroom.com today to take a step toward the career of your dreams. The Sports Business Classroom audio experience is brought to you by Hall Pass Media and Hall Pass Studios. Hall Pass Media is a full-service marketing agency that specializes in brand consulting, event management, digital marketing, and creative design. Hall Pass has a wide range of clients and partners that include the NBA Summer League, the NBA Coaches Association, and the basketball tournament, just to name a few. For more information, please visit hallpassnetwork.com. Hello and welcome to another episode of the SBC Audio Experience. I'm your host, Bo Estes. This week, we're mixing up the format a little bit. If you're listening to this show, you're probably aware of the Sports Business Classroom's general manager, Larry Coon, and his NBA salary cap expertise. We've had him on several episodes of the show and have done a lot of promotion of his online course, Cba Mastery with Larry Coon. Well, as it stands right now, the league has recently agreed upon a new CBA with the figures from the 2019-2020 season, as well as dates for the altered 2020-2021 season. So to help make sense of all of these new developments, Larry and his team of capologists, and I'm talking some really talented folks here, Eric Pincus, Ryan McDonough, and Calida Taylor, they hosted a webinar through Sports Business Classroom. So today's episode is the audio from that webinar. This is a wonderful opportunity for you. They talk about the agreed upon changes to the CBA, what is still left to be decided, what issues there are, as well as their prognostication on how things are going. As Larry emphasized in the recent episode he was on, an extensive knowledge of the salary cap is a surefire way to land and excel at a job in the NBA. So with that in mind, I give you Larry Coon, Eric Pincus, Ryan McDonough, and Calida Taylor. I feel like I'm introducing an all-star team. That's because I am. Take it away, guys.
Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this webinar. My name is Larry Coon. I am the general manager of Sports Business Classroom, and as you might infer by the name, I'm also the instructor at Cba Mastery with Larry Coon. Here's what we're going to do. There's going to be basketball this year. The league and the Players Association came to an agreement for what the league is going to look like. The league lawyers just sent out information to the teams about all the numbers. So we're going to take a look at what's going to be happening. I'm going to bring in a couple of guests, and we'll maybe make some predictions for the future. I would also like to introduce a good friend of mine. You have seen him on NBA TV. You have read him on Bleacher Report and other outlets. He is also one of the instructors at Sports Business Classroom. He is Eric Pincus. How you doing, Eric?
I'm doing great, Larry. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Great. And this webinar is brought to you by Sports Business Classroom and Cba Mastery on Demand. We're really excited about Cba Mastery because it's an on-demand course for learning the CBA. This is my curriculum for learning the CBA. I've been teaching it for a long time. I've taught it to teams. I've taught it to agents. I've taught it at Sports Business Classroom, and now it's available in an on-demand video format. And I go in even deeper than I do with anybody else. You can find details at sportsbusinessclassroom.com. We're going to talk more about it a little bit later in the show, and I want you to stay tuned for that because we're also going to be giving you a special offer just for being here on the webinar. All right, so Eric, there's going to be basketball. There's going to be a 2021 season. It's going to be great. Now things are moving. They're moving fast, right? The draft is on the 18th. This is what, the 12th? So less than a week away from the draft. They're gonna open up the trade restrictions. Free agency on the 20th. There's still going to be a moratorium, the July moratorium in November. It's going to be 2 days until teams can actually sign them. Camps are going to open December 1st. And we're going to get the 2021 NBA season, regular season, starting on December 22nd. I think 3 exhibition games are going to be squeezed somewhere in the middle. And it's going to be a 72-game season. So what do you think from a basketball perspective, as a fan of the game and of the league? What's this look like to you?
Well, I mean, you have basketball. We have the Christmas Day games. We have a chance for the Lakers to defend their title. We have a chance for the Clippers to reestablish themselves, for the Warriors to come back with Steph and Clay.
Don't forget about
the Warriors
them
again. On the East, the Bucks, can they be that number one team, or the Heat, the new powerhouse? All these kind of questions I love that we're going to get answers for. It's going to be a couple of weeks of pure madness in the NBA because we've got the draft, free agency, trades, all of that. It's like compressed into like a few days. It's going to be nuts. And I know front offices are losing their minds and they're going to push through it. And I'm going to try to make sense of it, of course. And so are you. We're going to look at all these numbers. We're going to have some fun. This
is uncharted territory. We've never seen a draft so close to free agency. Usually there's all this draft preparation that takes place as soon as a team's regular season stops, if they're not in the playoffs, or as soon as they're out of the playoffs, they're not taking a break. They're getting to work on the draft. They're doing, looking at players. They're bringing people in. They're going to the combine and other draft opportunities. They're doing their evaluations. They're doing their medicals. That's not happening this year. This is like you said, it's going to be pure madness. And then free agency right away. How do you see teams handling that? Now, some are going to, as is anything else, any other front offices, some are going to do better, some are not. But I would have to think, number one, that the teams that have been together for a long time from a front office perspective and are well stocked with people are going to do a lot better than the teams that are maybe being hastily assembled and have had turnover. Houston's had turnover. Sacramento's had turnover. Philadelphia's had turnover. What do you see teams like that doing?
Well, that's the thing, is that if you've been together as an organization for a long time, you're able to process difficult decisions quickly, because that's really what it amounts to. You do all the preparation in the world, but until things happen, and it happens quick. I mean, if you go back to the last year, the year before, like most of free agency on July 1st or whatever is done. I mean, the big decisions. And yeah, it took a few days for Kawhi Leonard and Paul George and all that stuff to come together, but it happened so fast. But I don't want to say that being prepared is going to that doesn't qualify you for being necessarily successful. I mean, some of it is just luck and being in the right position, having the right trade assets, drafting the right player. How often does the number 1, number 2, number 3 pick prove to be the number 1, number 2, 3 guy in that draft? And how many times is it Donovan Mitchell? Or if we stick with Utah, Rudy Gobert, who wasn't even a lottery pick, or Draymond Green, who was not even a first rounder. So it's so complex. And I will say that teams have had the most time possible to scout this class in the history of the NBA. Like, they've been looking at film since March. But at the same time, they didn't get to finish the tournament, and we didn't get to see the NCAA tournament. And they don't get all of those in-person kind of group workouts that we're used to seeing, where you might find someone. I remember Larry Nance with the Lakers, and I was there for that draft process covering the team. And he came in and was just so athletic. He wasn't even on some teams' second round list. Like, he was probably hovering around like 65 or so going into that. And some teams maybe had him in the 45 range. Lakers took him in the first round, and he turned out to be a very solid player. He's still in the league doing really well. And that was just from getting to see him in person and see that athleticism, which didn't necessarily translate in the games or on the page.
And in any draft year, there's always diamonds in the rough. You look at the past drafts, you're always going to see a guy in the second round who, when you look back at the draft 10 years later, you're going, how did this guy drop into the second round or late into the first round? But it happens. Players develop late, or players just don't get the opportunity to show themselves off, or have a bad combine or something else. So probably we're going to see a lot more variability this year, where 10 years from now, we need an asterisk on this draft almost to go, COVID year, because the whole process is different. Everything's different this year, not just the regular season of 72 games. I also want to take you back a little more than a year now, to June 30th of 2019, because that was when free agency opened, and they opened it 6 hours earlier. Now, on that day, I was doing a TV gig on Spectrum Sportsnet here in LA, and the free agency opened kind of just after I got in my car, because it's an hour drive up for me to get to the studio. And by the time I got to the studio, all our planning for the show was out the window. The whole show had changed, because during my drive, everybody, except for Kawhi Leonard, everybody committed to a team. Do you see free agency going that fast this year, or do you see there being a lot more variability, so a lot more reluctance?
So I don't think the NBA would want me to say that. I think most negotiations happen before they're supposed to. I think there's a lot of truth in that. I think the NBA, if it becomes public and someone talks about that, or something proof is put into the stratosphere, then you're going to be punished. But I don't think they can really enforce teams talking to players, teams talking to other teams, and all these sort of things. So there's no way that $1 billion in contracts were negotiated in 15 minutes or 2 hours or whatever.
Probably not.
No. So I think at some point it became clear what was going to happen. It became kind of clear where the cap was going. I've been using the current projection that I've had. The reality was my projection for at least 2 months, now 3 months. So I think teams are as prepared as they were going to be, and they've been negotiating with free agents, in the last like 2-3 weeks.
And we'll get a little bit more into some of those details, what the effects are when the cap is a little bit lower than what was originally projected. And also, since revenues are going to be low, we'll get into that in a little bit. But for now, I kind of want to move on to the facts as we know them, because the league today distributed their annual BRI memo, it's called, to the teams that says, okay, here's where revenues were, here's what the cap is going to be, here's what all the other ancillary figures around that are going to be. Here's the luxury tax. Here's everything else. Usually they project for next year. That was conspicuously absent from this memo this year, but it's all the rest of it was there. So here's what we know right now. So first of all, let's look back at last year, kind of the look at what happened during the 2019-2020 season. The revenues came in at $6.865 billion. Now, the original projection before the season started, before COVID, was a hair over $8 billion. So between COVID, China, and other factors, they didn't make about $1.169 billion that they were planning on making, which has a huge effect on the league, of course. Now, the fundamental part of the agreement between the league and the players is that the players get about half the money that comes in. It can vary anywhere from 49% to 51%, but they basically split the revenue 50-50. So when revenue goes down by more than $1.1 billion, the players get about half of that less. So almost $500 million. But it's tough because they sign their contracts before the season, even years before the season, planning on these revenue increases getting factored into it. So by the time you get to the end of a season like this, the players' contracts added up to a little bit over $4.1 billion. And that was supposed to be right around what they were supposed to earn, but because earnings were so far down, they were only entitled to about $3.5 billion. So they're entitled to, the formula worked out to 51%. They were at 60.1%. That was huge. So the league has mechanisms in place in any year to sort of give back money. It's sort of like you work at a job and you have payroll taxes withheld. They're going to take out money during the year. And then the next April 15th, when you do your taxes, you get to figure out, well, did I take out the right amount, or do I owe a little bit more, or do I get back some of what I gave you? The same thing happens with the league's escrow system. They take out a piece of the money, 10% of player salaries in a given year. And then that's supposed to get them right about to where they need to be so that they can figure out how much each side gets. Throw that out the window this year, because this year the escrow money, the full escrow fund, was $384 million, and that wasn't enough. Now, the CBA has built-in mechanisms for that. There's actually what's called a supplemental benefits pool that's funded out of 1% of BRI, basketball income. So that pool was $97 million this year, and the CBA says if escrow doesn't cover it, they tap into that. So they got all the league, the teams got all the escrow back. They got that supplemental benefits pool of $97 million back, but that still wasn't enough. Now, they saw this coming earlier in the year, and they started taking out extra escrow money starting May 15th. So that added up to about, over $350 million. Closer to $400 million. 1/3 of that, about $141 million, did get them back down to their designated share. The players got the remaining 2/3 back. So it was like a super escrow this year. So in the end, the players were entitled to 51% of the revenues, and that's exactly what they got, down to the dime, the way it always works out. They just had to do an extra escrow this year.
Yeah, and it actually worked out better for the players in the end. There was so much uncertainty when things went bad, and the league didn't know how was it going to work? Was the bubble going to work at all? It could have been a disaster. And so with that in mind, they took out 25% from the players' checks. But in the end, the amount is roughly or almost exactly 14% of the players' checks. So it should have been 10. It was bumped up to 14. They had taken out 25%. So the players, by doing their part, by following the rules in the bubble and by making it all work, made sure that they protected that income both for the league and for themselves.
That saved a lot of people. That the bubble, that could have gone either way. It could have been a disaster. If there was an outbreak inside the bubble, that could have ended the season immediately. And we might not have had that into the season. We might not have had a playoffs. We might not have had a finals. We might not have a Lakers championship right now. But no positives for players who were already in the bubble. So it was amazing. Yeah, and financially, it helped to save the league. Let's move on to luxury tax. So 4 teams were taxpayers: Portland, Miami, Oklahoma City. They're a repeater this year, and also Minnesota. So all of them were in that first band. Now, the luxury tax goes up every $5 million that you're over the tax threshold. The amount you pay goes higher. They were in the first band at $1.50 per dollar, except for Oklahoma City, who was at $2.50 because they are a repeater. Now, they did give teams who were taxpayers a tax break this year. Since revenues were down 50%, they gave teams that same break. So the way they did it is if you were it ended up being revenues were down 15%. So if you were 10 million over the tax line, you got a 15% break. You were now considered to be $8.5 million over the tax line, for example. So every team had their tax basis shaved off. And in the end, those 4 teams ended up paying a total of about $10.1 million in luxury tax. Now, half of that money goes to the teams that didn't pay the tax. So every team got a check for basically a little bit under $200,000 as their tax distribution. Now, some people have asked me, hey, didn't they give the tax-paying teams a break at the expense of the non-tax-paying teams because they would have made more? Well, first of all, it's not that much more. Without a break, those teams would have paid a total of about $11.9 million. So yeah, each team gave up about $33,000 that they would have gotten had they not given those teams a break. But the whole point is teams are now suffering the consequences of decisions that they had no information on several years ago. They're signing contracts on the basis of what they think is going to happen in normal years, and it wasn't a normal year. So yes, those teams are not paying as much luxury tax, but in a system that everybody is suffering from. So how do you think that turned out? Do you like it?
Well, I mean, I would say it makes sense for the teams that were over the tax, right? And looking ahead, what's been agreed to, because this is carrying forward, and so there's going to be this break on tax next year, and so I would say that teams that were not planning on ever being in the tax are looking at those big spenders who maybe would have been at least punished for overspending, and yet they're going to be able to spend more. And we're in kind of an imperfect situation, not by anyone's doing. This is just where we are as a world trying to face what challenges we have. And so I like it. I like that there's an incentive to spend because they need that. I mean, why should the product suffer is kind of the main point. Why punish the product and limit teams from doing what they would do because the numbers are off? And it might even be a greater discount this next year because there's still the tax line didn't change, and if they're using that same $8 billion projection, I think revenue might be lower this next season. I expect it to be lower because we had most of the season last year, right up until March. That's almost the whole regular season before the shutdown happened, and so we're not going to have that necessarily with fans in every arena, and we'll talk about that later. What that looks like. So they're doing their best to compromise. And I think the overarching thing that I just want to leave with this point is that compromise is happening between the league, between the players and the teams. They're doing what they need to do to make sure that we have the NBA. And I appreciate Adam Silver. I appreciate Chris Paul and Michelle Roberts for their part in making these difficult choices so that we have a lot to talk about and we can enjoy these games.
Very true. So just to quickly review some of the other numbers. So look in my CBA FAQ for the numbers for this to the 2019-2020 season, because the numbers are exactly the same. The cap is the same. The tax level is the same. The exceptions are the same. Max salaries are the same. Rookie scale, minimum salaries, they're all the same as last year because they just carried everything forward. Now, moving forward, the cap is going to grow at least 3% up to 10% next year. Now, that 10% figure stopped me dead in my tracks, and I'll talk about why in a minute. Escrow increases will be taken out. Now, if players owe more escrow to get the number down next year, they're going to take that out over 3 years. So the players are going to pay a maximum of 20% in any 1 year. And it's going to be the same luxury tax treatment moving forward. So, and it also looks like they're trying to get back to a normal schedule, 72 games, but they finished before the Olympics. And so far, it looks like they're going to be poised to start, assuming COVID cooperates, they're going to be poised to start the 2021 season on time. Now, it's important to keep the cap at where it was last year because the league likes some consistency in free agency from year to year. It shouldn't matter what year you become a free agent. You should hit a normal free agent market. So you and I were projecting all along that the cap was going to be set to where it was last year rather than take a huge drop because of the lack in revenue. So that makes perfect sense.
For sure. It could have dropped to like 85, 90. I didn't do the numbers, but I think in the $90 million range, which would have caused all kinds of problems for these existing teams and their existing salary structures.
Right. Now, I want to go back to that 10% maximum increase, because you and I have a word for that: cap smoothing. Mm-hmm. Right. They do not want the cap to increase too much or go down by too much from one season to the next. That happened in 2016 when the new TV money hit. The cap had a huge increase and it really caused havoc. Basically, all the free agency money from that cap, all the money from that cap increase had to go to the free agents. So Timothy Mozgov and Luol Deng ended up getting it all, where if they had put in cap smoothing then, the increase would have gone to every player in the league by the way that the CBA works. Well, this year, it looks like they're building that in. It could go up by a maximum of 10%, prevent that shock to the system, and make sure the money's distributed around. So that, I think, is going to be a good thing. There is not going to be a baseline salary reduction. That was one of my first questions. Even though they are playing 72 games rather than 82, their full salary amounts is what they're going to use, and they're just going to make up for everything through escrow. Back in 2011, when there was a 66-game season, they actually reduced the baseline salaries to 66 82nds. That's not going to happen this year. I think that the escrow limit also was a big concession from the league. For sure. To the teams, which probably was the give back in exchange for starting the season on December 22nd.
Yeah, 100%. That is absolutely why we're starting. It is so important to the league, partnered with the networks, to be there by Christmas. And if you think about it, a lot of players didn't play, they stopped in March at the shutdown, at least 8 teams. And then you had the teams that went to the bubble but didn't make the playoffs. They haven't played for a while. So it's harder on teams like the Heat, the Lakers, the Nuggets, Celtics, the teams that went deep into the playoffs or even the second round. But I think it was the right compromise. And the players getting a limit on their escrow is fantastic, because they probably should be giving up at least 30-something% of their money, whatever it ends up being. And they don't have to do it in 1 year and get to spread it out. That's a tremendous concession, I think, on the league's part, and why we have basketball back.
The other nice ancillary benefit to that, and I'll make this one last point before bringing on our first guest. The other nice benefit is that if you do happen to be a player who's this year is going to be your last year in the league, either because you're a fringe player or because you're a veteran who's just ready to retire, if you do owe that big tax bill this year, which would be 30%, you're not going to be here next year to pay up the other part. So it's sort of a outgoing benefit for the players who are going to be out of the league soon. So I like the way that worked out.
Yeah, and you could argue that someone like Gordon Hayward would opt out. If there was a huge escrow this year, maybe he'd be better taking like a $20 million multi-year deal versus getting 30, whatever it is this year. There are a lot of decisions that are going to be made off of these escrow numbers.
Well, let's talk about what players might do with our first guest, if we can get him online here. There he is. Everybody, please welcome Ryan McDonough. Ryan is a friend of Sports Business Classroom. He worked with us in person at the 2019 SBC in Las Vegas. Also in 2020 at our virtual event. If you missed it, that was entirely your loss, because it was a fantastic virtual event this year. He's been an executive with the Celtics and the Suns, including the general manager of the Suns. He's currently co-host of the Scallon Pal show on radio.com, along with Brian Scalabrine. Ryan, welcome to this webinar. I appreciate you being here. So what are your first thoughts?
Well, Larry and Eric, always great to be on with you guys. I appreciate you introducing me that way, because if you didn't, it seems kind of creepy that I have a picture of Brian Scalabrine over my shoulder. So I appreciate that. No, my first thoughts are obviously, and you guys touched on a lot of this in the open, is that we are in an unprecedented time for the NBA. So in my 15 plus years in front offices from 2003 to 2018, neither I nor anybody saw anything like this, all the challenges that teams are dealing with now. And Eric mentioned, what the next couple of weeks are going to look like, guys. These teams are drinking from a fire hose. You have a draft with limited player workouts. Teams can only work out a maximum of 10 players total, regardless of how many picks they have. There's no traditional combine. They did somewhat of a watered down virtual combine this this year. So there are no competitive workouts. Teams are limited as far as the medical information they've gotten. So that's a huge frustration, especially as you can imagine, if you're drafting at or near the top of the lottery and there's more pressure on those picks, you have to get it right, but you have less information. You guys mentioned the season shutting down. During the college conference tournaments, there was no NCAA tournament. So that's the challenge, especially for a lot of presidents and GMs, guys who do their scouting late. The scouts in the field are out, year round, basically going to practice and games year round. But some of the top decision makers intentionally go out late because they're dealing with their NBA team and with the trade deadline and player issues and all that. And then they go out and scout on the back end a lot in March and even in April. And that disappeared this year. So that threw a monkey wrench into that aspect of it. In the short term, beyond the draft guys, it's less than 48 hours from when the draft ends next Wednesday night to when free agency starts. The free agent period starts on Friday. That's insane. I mean, from a front office perspective, I think the shortest amount of time I can ever remember is 4 or 5 days. You at least had half a week to catch your breath, reset. As you guys know, there are traditionally a lot of draft night trades. So as you mentioned, actually, I think we were talking about it before we came on air, but the teams with continuity in the front office who have assigned roles and tasks and can make these adjustments on the fly in terms of which players ended up where, how does that impact the salary cap? How does that impact trade exceptions? All that. You have to really do that in real time this year. You're not going to have time to go back and reset and reevaluate. So you're going to have decision trees built on that. You're going to have to be able to adjust those pretty quickly. So those are my first thoughts, Larry. That obviously combined with the elephant in the room, which is COVID overhanging all of this. And, we can talk about that here in a minute.
Yeah, that's a big elephant in the room. And I've said a couple of times in a couple of different interviews, we have an agreement between two parties, the league and the union, about how this season's going to work. The third party in this agreement is not party to this agreement. That's COVID. And they are not a cooperating participant in this process. So everything could possibly blow up. And this is going to be a bad winter for COVID. As bad as this year has been, it's going to be a rough winter. And you've seen the numbers start to scale up. So how do we minimize or contain the spread of the virus, especially since there isn't going to be a bubble this year?
Well, that's a challenge, Larry. That's the biggest challenge for the league, especially now that all of the finances are hammered out, as you and Eric eloquently explained. That is the challenge. On one hand, we had the bubble in Orlando. We thought the basketball was great. There were 0 COVID cases, so it worked. You guys know it worked. Everybody watching this show and listening to it knows it worked. The problem was nobody liked being there. As you guys know, you talk to players, coaches, executives, broadcasters, print reporters, anybody who was in the bubble said, look, this is really tough. Especially the ones who were there for 2, 3, 4 months for the duration. It was really difficult to do, especially for those who have families and, young kids and all that. So I get all that. So nobody wanted to do it. However, the million-dollar question, which we don't have an answer to yet, is did they need to do it? And we'll find out here coming up pretty soon. I think if you look at what's happening in football now, for example, especially this weekend, look at the SEC schedule. There have been a bunch of games that were canceled in college football, and that has been the case. I think that'll continue to be the case as you mentioned, Larry, with the virus. It's the term I'm seeing now is uncontrolled spread. Well, if you have uncontrolled spread, that is pretty scary. So I think what the league is doing and what they will have to continue to do is have contingency plans. We've heard potentially having 6 days in March that is traditionally for the All-Star break and the All-Star game. Maybe that's a makeup session for teams if they do get wiped out for a week or so. Another thing I would look at that's being discussed is expanded rosters, or especially an expansion of the guys on two-way contracts. Right. Historically, they're limited to 45 days, giving those players more time because, if you have an outbreak and hits your team hard and you're down 4 or 5 players, the league rule, as you two know, is you have to have 8 in uniform. So there could be a scenario, God forbid, where, the virus hits a team really hard, players have to quarantine. So they better make sure they have at least 8, ideally more than that, but enough players to play the game and to keep the schedule going down the tracks.
Now, as I'm sure you know, this virus is highly communicable. There's a figure called an R0, which says how much one person's going to spread to another person. And that's over 3, which means the average infected person is going to infect over 3 other people. And you just multiply that out. You get a big spread really quickly, which is one of the things that makes this particular virus so dangerous. So if someone on a team gets it, The team's going to get it. Everybody else who's around them is going to get it. Their families are going to get it. And the players on the other team are going to get it. This is, if you're playing basketball, you got to be in contact with other players. So can you maybe be scheduling games in a way and locating games in a way that if there is an outbreak, you're going to keep it from being a widespread type of thing? Maybe you isolate several teams together and having them play each other. So if there's an outbreak here, it's only going to spread to a couple of teams rather than the whole league. If you're playing another team in your division 3-4 times, maybe you play all 3 of those games at once rather than spread those out through the seasons. What are the scheduling things we can do?
Yeah, I think the easiest one, Larry, as you mentioned, is playing, and this, I'd love to see this be a permanent change going forward, playing teams. You've talked about the reduction in games from 82 to 72. We'll see how that impacts the schedule specifically. The league has talked about a 25% reduction in travel, but I think the easiest fix, the simplest fix, is if you still play the teams in your own division 4 times, the 4 other teams 4 times, then play both times in the same market on the same trip. That's easy. So if the Boston Celtics play the Toronto Raptors or New York Knicks, Brooklyn Nets, Philadelphia 76ers, twice at home and twice on the road. Well, the twice on the road should be on the same trip, maybe a Friday, Sunday, or a Monday, Wednesday, whatever it is. Could even be back-to-back days. And then the twice at home should be on the same trip, the other way, the reverse of that. So that's the easy fix. That's something that obviously, for those of us, like me, have done the travel with NBA teams and specifically the players in the load management era, that's something they want. Think of more like Major League Baseball. I don't think you'll see 4-game series, for example, but something like that where a team goes to a market, they stay in a market. And this year, I think in particular, that makes sense because it's only one time in and out, and then you're gone. I also think the league should look at, to the extent they can, when you go cross conference, if teams from the East are coming west, they play LA every trip, Lakers, Clippers, same with New York, Brooklyn. One monkey wrench here that we'll talk about in a minute is where are the Toronto Raptors going to play? So you have 29 teams doing, something similar. And then one in Toronto, who it seems like the Canadian government, they did it with the Blue Jays. If they do not allow American teams to come and go, where, we've heard Tampa Bay, we've heard Nashville. It seems like Tampa is the hot, name today. That is, on the East Coast. It's in the Eastern time zone, but it's not geographically convenient, obviously, to the 4 teams in the Northeast corridor, Philly, the 2 in New York and Boston. So those are all the issues that teams are working through. I don't envy the Raptors front office. They have a lot of big free agents, as you guys know, with Van Vliet, Ibaka, and Gasol. They're trying to figure out where to play. Again, keep in mind logistical challenges with that as well. Not only where you play, where do you practice, where do the players live, how do you get the equipment you need? It's a logistical nightmare for Toronto, and I feel bad for Masai Ujiri and Bobby Webster and those guys who have to deal with that right now.
Well, here's a question I just thought of, so I'm going to surprise you with it. Let's say that a team, and it could be it's definitely going to be the Raptors, but it could be any team where in their home arena, the laws are going to be such that they can't have fans in the arena. But there's an opportunity for the team to go to an alternate site like the Raptors might have to do and play their games there, but they will be able to get fans in. Are they going to have the opportunity to make that decision? Or is the league going to dictate, no, you stay in your own arena and go by whatever they're going to have unless you have to move? And if they have that opportunity, are they going to do it for the sake of getting fans into games?
Boy, that's a great question, Larry. I don't have an answer to that because, I think that's most applicable to one team, right, in Toronto. It could happen to any team, but it's most applicable to one. One of the things I've noticed doing, what I do now, the broadcast with radio.com, with the shows and the in-market interviews, is that a lot of people, I think most people assume that when the NBA season starts on December 22nd, there won't be any fans in the stands. That is not the case. As you guys know, it's a team by team, even state by state thing. It seems like the California teams, for example, will not have fans in the stands given the way they've handled the virus. It's obviously been a more conservative approach. Oklahoma City put out a memo the other day about guidelines, social distancing. It seems like they are going to have fans in the stands. If the teams are being honest, Larry and Eric, you guys know this better than anybody, but if you asked the owners anonymously, said, would you like to have fans in the stands? They said, of course we would. Put as many in as possible. We don't want to be reckless about it, but at least the high dollar seats around the court. Now, maybe you put up some kind of plexiglass or the courtside seats are in the 5th or 10th row instead of, on the wood. Maybe you do that, but the suites in particular, think of where the suites are located, usually in the middle of the arena around the lower bowl. Let's load those up, even go every other suite for social distancing. Let's do rapid testing and something like that. So our in-market revenue number, which, as Adam Silver said, is about 40% of the NBA's revenue. We need that number. If you're an owner of a team, you need and want that number not to be zero, even if it's a fraction of what it usually is. Something is better than nothing.
I agree with you.
Let me jump in here, Larry. Do you think it's possible that we have a 72-game schedule, that when the league comes out, by the way, I mean, the league planner to plan the schedule and the amount of time that they have to plan, I can't even imagine. But do you think that they maybe plan out the schedule for maybe 42 games and leave or 52 games and leave the back end of the schedule kind of open? Or do the networks need something more concrete? I mean, I don't really know how that works, but I don't know how you can plan everything that far down the line when we're in such a world of uncertainty.
Yeah, I think you're going to see exactly what you said, Eric, a partial schedule release. I don't think over the next couple of weeks you're going to see, okay, here are the 30 teams and here's their 72-game schedule. To your point, I think you'll see about half of that. And then what I'm guessing the league will do is say at some time, probably early in 2020, we'll decide on the second half, right? And the second half may depend on, we got the good news from Pfizer early this week that seems like the vaccine works, at least, from the news reports, it's 90% effective. So if that is the case, then maybe they could play the second half of the year with no fan restriction, no social distancing. If that, I don't know if that's realistic or not. You have to ask the U.S. government and Pfizer and some of the, pharmaceutical companies if getting a vaccine and widely distributed and having, herd immunity, whatever you want to call it, if that is likely by, say, March, then I think the league will maybe say, all right, the second half of the season, the rules will be different than the first. But that has to be built in, Eric, those contingencies, those abilities to pivot on the fly. As Larry mentioned, the most prudent way to do it overall would be bubble like they did in Orlando. The second most prudent would be smaller bubbles. The league is not going to do either one of those things. I understand why, but that means there is more risk, which also I think necessitates more flexibility on the back end of the schedule.
I'm going to switch this over to a team perspective. And for those of you listening, I do see some questions coming in. We are going to try and get to those, but we'll do that at the end. So from a team perspective, now you could say that a rising tide lifts all boats, but teams are going to be affected differently by this because teams are in different situations. So do you see any teams that are especially affected by what's going on right now?
Yeah, I think you guys touched on it earlier. It relates to the front offices, also relates to the teams, obviously, on the floor. The teams with a lot of turnover are going to be affected. I look at a team like the New York Knicks. You have a new president of basketball operations. I guess Leon Rose came in, late last year. Tom Thibodeau's new. His staff is new. You guys know the contracts and the cap as well as anybody. They have a bunch of decisions to make, a bunch of player options, I think most of which they will decline. So if they do that, that means not a lot of new players coming in. That's one other thing, guys, that we have to talk about is the transition, I should say, when you acquire a player, he's not going to be able to get off the plane at LAX and go practice for the Lakers or Clippers, that day or the next day. He's going to have to quarantine. He's going to have to test. That'll put some challenges into the preseason. Not to get too deep in the weeds here, but NBA teams schedule their own preseason games. So I have no idea how they're going to handle that either. How in a shotgun start in this period, the span of a couple weeks, and that's when preseason's going to start. The first or second week of December. At this point, as we sit here in mid-November, how are they going to do that? So there are a bunch of logistical issues, but to answer your question, Larry, the teams with continuity, with stability, I look at like the Boston Celtics, for example, they bring pretty much the entire crew back next year. I think that gives them an advantage. The teams that are maybe slightly disadvantaged, especially early in the season, I think are obvious. The Miami Heat, Jimmy Butler, the player in particular, with the load he carried, LeBron James and the Lakers, what he and Anthony Davis had to do playing until mid-October. I read somewhere that it was 71 days from game 6 of the NBA Finals when the finals ended to opening night. That is the shortest offseason in the history of any sport. So that turnaround is really, for the star players who had to carry a heavy load, LeBron and Jimmy Butler in particular, I think the teams will have to be careful about how they use them early in the year, especially when we're in the load management era with LeBron James in particular, the game's biggest star. He's in year 18, as you guys know, in his mid-30s. The Lakers are going to have to be really strategic about how they approach it. That my guess is they'll be very conservative, limit his minutes, or even give him some nights off early in the season.
Yeah, my daughter's club volleyball team's always had a much longer break than that, and she was still sore when she came back. So I can't imagine why people like LeBron are going to have to go through. Let's continue from the team perspective. How do you think teams are going to be doing their financial projections for next year? Because anything could happen.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. Like, I mean, you brought in the band and the range,
Right.
and that's a good thing. That's something that when I was GM of the Phoenix Suns in 2016, not only us in the Suns front office, but a majority of teams just blew a gasket when the league did not do the cap smoothing. You mentioned the contracts to Mozgov and Biyombo. Somebody should write a book. It may be a short book, but I personally would read it about all the horrible contracts that got handed out in 2016. Luckily, as you guys know, as we sit here in 2020, just about all those contracts have expired. Nicholas Batum, I'm sorry, Charlotte fans, you get one more year of Nicholas Batum at close to $30 million. That may be the exception, but I give the Players Association a lot of credit, Larry and Eric. They learned from their mistakes. They learned that was not the right thing to do. It disproportionately benefited players in the 2016 class. It disadvantaged the guys who had signed before and then after that, and it was just a ridiculous spending spree. So I think the teams will be conservative. There is some concern about revenue sharing and things like that. Larry, with revenues going down, will the league continue what is a relatively robust revenue sharing? You and Eric probably know that better than I do. But basically, guys, what the league is worried about is, can the New York teams and the LA teams outspend everybody regardless of the cap? And then if they make less money is shared, with the other teams. Those are things that have been discussed, and you don't think all 30 owners view those kind of issues the same way at the league level, that they're all in it together. If you own a team in New York or LA, you want to take advantage, of your advantage. If you own a team in Memphis or OKC, you want it more balanced. So those are the kind of things I think we'll continue to see, Larry. But at the end of the day, again, the organizations and teams with more continuity, I expect to do well early. And then also keep in mind, there were 8 teams who haven't played a game since March. So those 8 teams are raring to go. 7 of them, I think, will probably be not great again this year. Maybe with 1 or 2 exceptions in there. But the one we all have our eyes on is Golden State. How will they do? How will they come back? I imagine they're going to look pretty good, especially early in the season.
And the big thing with them is injuries, right? And, Kevin Durant left, but he also left an injured player. So how do you see this affecting players like Kevin, Klay Thompson, the people who had some pretty big injuries this past year?
Yeah, well, they've had a lot of time. I mean, they've had more time than normal. Keep in mind, Klay Thompson and Kevin Durant were injured in June of 2019. That's almost a year and a half ago now, in the 2019 finals. So that's more time than it traditionally takes. I'm of the 2 guys, I'm more focused on Durant, because in my 15 plus years in NBA front offices, 10 plus with the Celtics, 5 plus with the Suns, that is the injury that different trainers and doctors and medical staffs we're worried about. The blown Achilles. You guys know the history of it's not very good. So keep an eye on Durant, especially early in the year. That is maybe the most fascinating and volatile team to me, or potentially volatile team with the Brooklyn Nets. You have Durant coming back, Kyrie Irving coming back. How do the guys who were some of their breakouts, I don't want to say stars, but had good breakout seasons last year in Karis LeVert and Spencer Dinwiddie in particular, how do they handle a reduced role? How does Steve Nash do as a first-time head coach with high expectations and a big payroll and a lot of coaching power and a lot of coaching money on the bench alongside him? That's a team I'm looking at early in the year. It could go great. They're theoretically talented enough to compete for a championship, or it could go pretty bad. So Brooklyn, in addition to Golden State, is a team I have circled to watch, especially early on in the season.
Great. Okay. I'm going to move on and bring in our next guest. As soon as she pops on the screen here.
There she is.
And you stay on, Ryan. We're going to make this a group discussion. Welcome, Calida Taylor. Calida Taylor is a graduate of 2 famous institutions of higher learning, Harvard Law School and Sports Business Classroom. She came to work with us at the program in both 2019 and 2020. More recently, she was on the NBA TV show GM School, and she kicked ass. She won the competition. Welcome, Calida. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Of course. I'm so glad to have you on. So when you look at this, what do you see? What stands out to you?
Honestly, it's a boring answer, but I see a lot of work still yet to do. There's a lot of player option dates and non-guarantee dates and the other logistical things to fill in, like when's the trade deadline going to be. So that's one thing that definitely popped up. The league's lawyers and the player association lawyers are going to have to dig in and cover all those little holes and get everything filled in. But I'm really excited about the season restarting. As a fan, just being greedy and wanting more basketball, I thought the bubble was awesome. I'm really excited about the play-in tournament too. I don't think anyone's mentioned that, for the back end of the playoffs. I think that's a really great, innovative change for the league to take on. So really excited about that. And then as a cap nerd, I'm just going to be ready to track what the teams are doing. I mean, it seems like with the flat tax and the flat apron, there's going to be a lot of tight maneuvering on the spreadsheets to get full rosters filled out. We're wondering about the injuries and whether or not teams are going to have to use more temporary contracts, 10-day contracts, and other things to fill in their rosters with the shortened season. So yeah, I'm excited to watch it and track it.
So from a basketball perspective, how do we, and this is a question for anybody, how do we expect the basketball to look? Is it going to be just a hot mess for the first month, or are things going to look a little bit closer to normal sooner than we think?
Well, I think it's going to be sloppy, Larry. I mean, I think especially the teams, as we've talked about, with a number of changes, a number of new players in the roster. Keep in mind, this wasn't what most people were anticipating, right? Over the last couple of weeks, we heard MLK Day. It's not going to be the 2020-21 season. It's going to be the 2021 season. That seemed like it was going to happen until about 3 or 4 weeks ago. So it'd be interesting to see what the players have done as far as their off-season routines, especially the ones who played deep into the playoffs and understandably would want to take some time off and let their body recover and all that. So I think it'll be a little bit sloppy early on. I think the shotgun format of the preseason will, lend itself to that. Also, keep in mind that you may have patchwork lineups. We hope not, obviously, but if there is a virus outbreak with the uncontrolled spread that we discussed earlier, you may have some guys that have never even practiced or played together, and throw them out there in a live game to see how they do. So I think it'll be sloppy. However, the caveat to that is I thought the basketball in Orlando was going to be relatively sloppy, and I don't think it was. I thought it was great. So what do I know? But this year, I think they're close to 150 players who are free agents as well. So I think it's a different situation because in Orlando you had 22 teams coming back, basically the same. Here you have different, new teams coming together that don't have that continuity experience. That, as Eric pointed out earlier, those teams that played 75 to 80% of their schedule already. These teams are now starting from scratch.
So from a player perspective, go ahead, Eric.
No, well, I was going to say I thought shooting was going to be bad in the bubble because if you go back to the lockout years, in the shortened rush seasons, the shooting was poor. And I thought there would be maybe a higher rate of injury with players who had kind of been off, and the training was very spotty for a lot of different players. They had different access to different things when the league was shut down. So I was very surprised and pleased. So maybe, all common sense says, yeah, this should go wrong. This should go wrong. Maybe it'll work out in a much more positive way. I think defensively teams are going to struggle a little bit. I think that takes a little bit longer to build a defensive unit than it does necessarily guys scoring, because guys can score in this league, especially if the defense isn't up to par.
So, and Calida mentioned some of the things coming up with, like, we might see some weird stuff happening with contracts. What do we think is going to happen? Are we going to see a lot of high value contracts for 1 year and let things settle down? Or are we going to see long-term deals? Are we going to see players maybe getting a little bump above, or are teams going to be a little bit more conservative?
All the above. It's going to be all over the map, in my opinion. I just think it's going to go case by case, team by team, situation by situation. We're going to see teams running for the hills and teams throwing out money and players wanting money now, players wanting money later. I think it's going to be a mess, to be honest. A good mess, a fun mess.
Yeah, and I wonder if some teams that don't normally pay the tax will just have to bite the bullet and do it this year. I'm thinking of like Indiana, for example. They're really close to it.
Don't say Indiana and tax in the same sentence.
Yeah. So it's like, I'm really interested to see how they maneuver out of that situation, if they maneuver out of that situation, or if they just pay the tax.
Yeah, that's going to be funny. Where teams that were previously loath to pay the luxury tax, Indiana being one of those teams, if this might be the only way out and this is an anomalous year.
Yeah, unless they trade Victor Oladipo for a younger player or a draft pick or something like that, which Jay Michael out of Indianapolis reported that today, that, Victor Oladipo saying to other teams, can I play with y'all? So that's something to keep an eye on there. That's another team with not a lot of roster turnover, but, the coaching staff is new. Do they put Miles Turner in play? Oladipo seems like he wants to get traded. So that's a team that could look very different a month from now than it does today.
Well, and this is one of my questions, right? If the situation demands, you either need to make a decision to benefit the team financially or, at the expense of the product on the basketball court, or the opposite. Which do they choose? And I know Eric's going to say, well, some will choose, it's going to go both ways. But what's going to be the trend here?
Well, Larry, I've worked for two teams. One would choose the team on the basketball court, and the other would choose the financial aspect of it. But I'm not going to specify. I'll let you guys figure out which is which.
I think that we all understand exactly what you're implying here.
Okay.
Well, it's going to depend on what teams are close to winning, and then also different ownership groups are hit differently by circumstance. I think probably Steve Ballmer's doing okay, and Mark Cuban's probably doing just fine. But some of these organizations that are in the restaurant business, the hotel business, the cruise business are probably hit more savagely. But then at the same time, can they stomach a short term, like the Miami Heat? They're a true contender. They were in the finals. They may be more willing even to take a loss right now because of circumstance. So you can't just go by any one rule and say this is how it's going to be. And you mentioned the Pacers. Like if they weren't willing to pay a $5 million tax, and the discount, because of the way the rules work now, they pay 4.75 million in tax, or 4.5 million in tax, or whatever it reduces to. I don't think that is a significant enough of a reason for them to. I think they're going to make moves to get out of that tax. I think that's going to be a hard line. I think just some teams are going to this is the range you could spend, period. Make it work and figure it out. And it's going to vary team by team, which is what Larry said I would say.
One other point along those lines, guys, as you guys know the cap as well as anybody, there's a limited number of teams with cap space. If you look at the teams with cap space, a lot of those teams are the worst teams in the Eastern Conference. So one thing, Calida made a great point about not enough people talking about the play-in tournament. I thought that went great last year. That's something I've been advocating for personally for years, including when I was in the Suns front office. But another thing that people aren't talking about, there's a limited amount of cap space. The teams, if you look at the records from last year and then project the teams forward this year, they're expected to be some of the worst teams in the league again this year. And then from what I'm hearing from my team sources is that a team like the Detroit Pistons, may not necessarily spend that money on players. They may absorb, bad contracts and use it as a dumping ground if those contracts are incentivized, with young players or draft picks or things like that. So it's the league did the free agents in particular in this year's class a huge favor by artificially inflating the cap, or holding it, at 109, we should say. As Eric mentioned, if it dropped into the 80s or even 90 million, those guys were in a lot of trouble, especially when you look at the teams. If you're a veteran player who wants to win, especially, if you're in your mid to late 20s or in your 30s, if you look at the teams with cap space, you say, well, I don't necessarily want to go play for those teams, and those teams may not necessarily have interest in me because they are so far away from a championship contending level.
That's a great point. I'm going to start asking for some predictions. So around my family dinner table, my wife likes to keep conversation going. She asks everybody for their peak and pit of the day. Basically, what was the best thing that happened during the day and the worst thing that happened during the day. And of course, it's an opportunity to say, oh, my peak was this great meal, honey. Don't make assumptions. I do most of the cooking in the family. So I'm going to ask everybody for what they think the peak and pit is going to be for this upcoming season. And we're gonna throw Calida under the bus first and start with her.
Well, I think a reasonable peak, I don't think that the season will go as smoothly as the bubble. The bubble was an immense success. If you look at the other professional sports leagues, there's going to be positive tests. There's going to be disruption. It's just kind of the reasonable reality. But I think the peak is the league was able to withstand those disruptions and pull off a successful overall healthy season, I think that that's a reasonable thing that might happen. The pit for me it goes back to COVID. I mean, it goes back to complete lockdowns, whether or not it affects the schedule. You have to cut more games. I mean, it's kind of like the worst case scenario. And also player health. I mean, you've got players that have been off the court, some of them for a very long time. So how's their conditioning? Are they going to suffer any injuries from underuse over that time versus the condensed schedule? Would that lead to some injury? So that's kind of the pit for me. But hopefully we're going to be more toward the peak.
Ryan?
Yeah, I think the Calida mentioned the obvious pit, and that is COVID. So I'll say something different. And this has been a point of contention with NBA teams, owners in particular, for a couple of years now. As you guys know, Eric and Larry, we did SBC in person in Las Vegas a year and a half ago now, last summer, and it came up in the 2019 Board of Governors meeting. That is star players, especially in smaller markets or mid markets, getting max contracts, and then not even toward the end of their contract, but somewhere toward the middle of the contract saying, I want out. I want to demand a trade. That is an issue the league has to address. For example, and I hope this doesn't happen with one guy in particular, but Devin Booker, who we drafted in Phoenix, he gave the extension to. Karl Anthony Towns in Minnesota is exactly in the same situation, same contract, basically with 4 years left on a max deal off the rookie scale. Is there a point where somebody shortly after signing a max contract with a number of years, I don't know if 3-4 years left, says, I want out? Well, the money's guaranteed. So my recommendation, if the league is listening, hopefully we have some folks from the league listening, is if you do sign a max contract, there's some kind of, periods, call it a moratorium, whatever you want, where the player cannot be traded, whether he wants to or the team wants to or not. Larry and Eric, Calida, I'd say, half, if you sign a 5-year contract for the first 2.5, 3 years, it's a max off the rookie scale, the player cannot be traded. League rules, that requires a CBA change, as you guys know. You know that better than anybody, Larry. But I think the league in the next round of collective bargaining should look at something like that. So some star players, in smaller mid-markets don't say, thank you for the max money, I want to be here. And then, any time from 5 years to 5 minutes later, change their mind and say, actually, I want to be traded. So that's the pit. I hope I didn't go on too long there, but that is a significant issue with the league. The peak is going to be, LeBron James, how long can he play at this level? Nobody's ever done what he's done before at his age. And the teams that are coming for him, the Clippers, is this their last stand with Kawhi Leonard and Paul George now just 1 year away from free agency? The Warriors, can they regroup? Watching Giannis in Milwaukee, can the Bucks compete well enough and not flame out in the playoffs? So that's the peak, as it always is for me. The basketball and, how well teams or how poorly teams do, how does that impact the star players and their decisions next summer? Because as you guys know, the 2021 free agent class is loaded. And so we could see some big names on the move next year if their seasons don't go as planned.
Yeah. What do you think, Eric?
Well, I thought the NBA was a model for how society should deal with the environment that we're in right now. And that was the bubble, and it was so successful. And I don't want the desire to earn a little bit more money and it was too expensive to sully that in a way. So that's the pit. It's similar to, Calida's point. We want this to be a healthy season. The peaks are, there's so many, a season with fans. How about Calida in a front office running, helping to run things? That would be a peak for me, former student. Just enjoying the game. This is I got into this industry because I love the game and it's so much fun for me. So I work very hard, but it's not work because I'm doing what I like. So I hope that carries over to the players and the front offices, and that we're able to see this great game successfully run through the rest of the year. And here's hoping, Larry. I think there's a lot to look forward to, but there's a lot of scary things and a lot of ways this thing could go very badly. So I'm hoping.
Yeah. Well, first of all, you all got the peak wrong. The peak was that there was an opportunity for the league to opt out of the CBA and they would have to renegotiate a whole new CBA. Mm-hmm. The peak is that I do not have to rewrite my FAQ from scratch because they tore up the CBA. That's my peak. The pit, like you guys were just saying, we're in a race right now. COVID is still out there. As Ryan mentioned, the Pfizer vaccine, they announced that the preliminary results there at about 90% efficacy on that, which is a great number to be at. We have to worry about when's it going to get out there. Do we have the infrastructure to be able to distribute it well? Because there are some storage considerations. It has to be kept very, very cold. There are other things like that, but it is going to be out there pretty soon. Hopefully we get to compliance. Hopefully we get out in front of this thing, because it's a race and it's going to be a rough winter. And if the virus wins, it could wreck the whole season. If we get the vaccine out and we just keep everything protected in the meantime, keep your fingers crossed, it could be great. So, thank you, all three of you, for that. I do want to leave a little bit of room, and I know that we're kind of running right at 4:00 right now, Pacific time, but I do want to leave some room for some audience questions. So if you don't mind if we run just a little bit late. But before we do that, I do want to talk a little bit about Cba Mastery. And remember, I told you that there was going to be a special offer. So if you're on this webinar, you're interested in the business of basketball, and you've just heard a whole bunch about it from 3 people. So do you have a goal to work in the league? Do you want to be in a front office, be an agent? Or if you're like where I was many years ago, just with a desire to understand this thing a little bit better. So for the last 5 years, I've been teaching the business of basketball at Sports Business Classroom, and we've been immersing students into the workings of the league itself. And I've been teaching it for much longer than that. The Sports Business Classroom includes instruction in collective bargaining, and I also teach the CBA directly to teams and to aspiring agents. My CBA curriculum is now available as an on-demand video course. There's a lot there. We worked on this for a very long time. There's 11 and a half hours of video content here, spread out across 23 videos, and it's on demand, so you can watch it at your own pace and come back to it at any time. And there's also a ton of bonus material to go along with it. Every video ends with a quiz for the sort of a recital. Recall just what you just covered to help you learn it. Exercises to go out and really apply what you just learned. We give you key term sheets to give you the definitions to refer to. References to the relevant sections of the CBA to go to your outside reading. We give a transcript of every video. There's a final exam. And we're also setting up a Cba Mastery forum on the site for you to be able to ask questions and engage into discussions. So all of this is available online for you to learn on demand at your own pace. And that's with Cba Mastery with Larry Coon. Go to sportsbusinessclassroom.com, click on Cba Mastery, and you can sign up for it. You can sign up for it right after this webinar. And because you're here, and you're spending time with us watching this video, we're going to make you a special deal. For the next 72 hours through Sunday, we're going to give you 10% off of Cba Mastery. We have a promo code, Mastery72HRS, all lowercase, Mastery 72-hour promo code. That's going to give you 10% off the course. And if that wasn't enough, but wait, there's more. We're going to throw, just for signing up with the code Mastery 72 hours, in the next 72 hours, we're going to add you to our email list, our exclusive list that when we know of jobs within the industry that are available, we send out emails to people. We're going to give you a discount in Sports Business Classroom 2021, the immersive experience in Las Vegas. Some of you have been to this before. You know how good that is. The discount will be subject to you being admitted to the program, of course, but we're going to provide that. We're also going to provide you with placement on our exclusive VSL Talent website. Think of VSL Talent like LinkedIn for basketball. Teams, networks, all sorts of companies based in and around sports use VSL Talent as a way of finding talent. We have gotten people references for jobs and opportunities through VSL Talent. I mean, heck, all of the contestants who were on GM School, including Calida Taylor, they perused VSL Talent to check out everybody that they were interested in. So we're going to give you access to VSL Talent to get your profile on there. I can't emphasize how valuable that is. And finally, we're also going to give you access to our Sports Business Classroom 2020, our virtual conference. We're going to give you access to those videos. There's like 60 hours of on-demand video content there. the SBC covered everything from the basic job skills, resume building and networking and interviewing, through the salary cap, scouting video analytics, media opportunities. And there were a ton of speakers. Of course, Eric was teaching along beside me. Ryan and Calida both worked with us on that. Mike D'Antoni came in and spoke. Kirk Goldsberry, of course, the great analytics person. Neil O'Shea, the general manager of the Portland Trailblazers. Gillian Zucker, the president of the Clippers. Tommy Shepard, the GM at Washington. Mark Jones, the great broadcaster who's now with Sacramento. Nate Duncan, of course, and if you're familiar with me, you're probably familiar with Nate. Many, many more. So all that's going to be available to you. Once again, go to sportsbusinessclassroom.com, click on CBA Mastery to register, and use the code MASTERY72HRS to get the discount and take advantage of all this opportunity. So we're running a little bit late, but I am going to take a couple of questions. I'm just kind of looking at the question chat here, and I might toss this to some of you guys. Carter Pollock asks, do you guys feel that we could see a lot more than usual of one-year deals with players re-signing with their own teams this offseason? Ryan, what are your thoughts there?
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, I do. I do think you'll see that because of the financial uncertainty. As we mentioned, there is a ban, but the 3 to 10%, it is not what was anticipated a year ago. They thought the chance of the cap would move significantly higher than that. And also, as I mentioned before, if you're a good player on a good team, for example, I'll pick one guy, Marcus Morris, who the LA Clippers gave up a first-round pick for with the trade with the New York Knicks at the deadline. Morris is an unrestricted free agent. Well, I don't think a team like the Detroit Pistons has any interest in him. I don't think he has any interest in them. So if the teams with significant cap space, say north of the exceptions, 10 million or more, don't have interest in you, that makes your bird rights all the much more valuable. So I think you'll see some of that, guys re-signing on one-year deals. I'm certain what you'll see. In fact, we saw one today in Mike Conley, those high-salaried players with options. Mike Conley was just the first. Look for Andre Drummond, probably Gordon Hayward, likely DeMar DeRozan, all those guys with high-dollar player options to opt in, play out one more year, and then hit free agency next year when there are better teams and more money in the pipeline, and hopefully the world has gone back to normal, and those guys drive their market value up that much more.
I was going to say on that it was already going to be a down year for free agency. This made it more extreme, but there was never going to be more than those 4 teams anyway. Maybe the Suns can get in the cap room, or the Heat, or the Raptors, depending on who stays. There are other teams who could join the fray, but it was always going to be a down year for free agency. So this kind of just made what was already going to happen. Guys staying for 1 year, where else are they going to go, right? It's like the opportunities aren't there. If anything, the lower tax line is really the most significant part, because that may limit teams from using their full mid-level exception and their biennial exception, because that triggers a hard cap. And we haven't gotten too deep into the weeds on all those little rules, but basically there's a spending limit. And so that lower tax line means there's just not that much money out there. So guys, for the most part, are going to opt in. You'll see players who have maybe, Anthony Davis is going to opt out so he can get a bigger deal. And maybe minimum players will opt out because you could always re-sign for the minimum somewhere else. But in between, if you're making $5, $10 million, $30 million, like Hayward or whatever his number is, you're probably going to opt in because that money is there and there's nowhere else to get it.
I'm going to take this question. Stephen Schneider asks, how likely is this period of time likely to lead to dramatic changes to the CBA in the future? So for the next CBA, what are the lessons learned that they're going to apply to it? Ryan already covered a lot of that, but I want to make one additional point. In talking to one good friend who's an assistant GM of one of the teams, he made a great point to me when we were talking about this at one time, because there is language built into the CBA. There is the force majeure paragraph that says what happens if they miss a few games. There's the significant drop in revenue clause to the CBA, which just says if there's a huge sudden drop, they're just going to have to negotiate and figure out what to do about it, which is exactly what happened. And my friend made the point, everybody in the league knows, who deals with the CBA, knows that these provisions are in there. Nobody's read them, right? We've never had the point where any of these things have needed to be invoked. Well, there are going to be a lot of lessons learned by this, and that's going to inform them what's going to happen in the future. And we cross our fingers. We say, we hope something like this never comes up again. But if it does, we need to build in a little bit more protection for things like that. And I think that the next CBA is going to see a lot more of that. In addition to, as Ryan alluded to, and as I've talked to other people about, there's always a lot of great things we can do to sort of protect that balance between teams being able to retain their talent and players being able to use their freedom of movement and go to where they want to go. I'm going to go to another question. An anonymous person asks, which team do you guys think benefits most with the new luxury tax rules?
Teams that are going to spend into the luxury tax.
Yeah.
It's going to be situational.
Right. Yeah. And there's a slight disadvantage to the teams that aren't paying the tax because they're going to get a little bit less of a distribution. But like we were saying earlier, some teams who might have been hesitant to enter the tax might be a little bit more, and that helps to free up spending and free up the league a little bit more. Another person asked, given the current COVID conditions, could front-loading money for the 2020 free agent class be used as a way to get around the new escrow charges? In other words, we know that the escrow is going to be spread out among more years. Let's front load as much as possible, and rather than backloading it, we'll put as much money as we can up front.
So a descending contract, basically.
Yeah.
There's a limit to what you can do, in that raises are either 8% or 5%, and so correspondingly the decreases can only be 8% or 5%. 8% if it's your own player, 5% if it's another team's player that you're signing, or a non-bird player. So there is some of that you can do, and some teams have already decided that's how they want to operate. I think you can see a trend where I think like the Magic are a team that have done that, where generally speaking they'll pay guys and descend their contracts, but it's difficult to do like we're going to pay somebody a huge amount in the first year and then drop a lot. And then you can't like drop 40%. It's not really structurally there. We might be able to find a situation where there's a restructure that could happen, like a team with cap room, like the Hawks. Maybe you could find a way to do something a little more funky than what we're discussing. But realistically, there's other than the small margins, there's no real massive way to do that in the NBA.
Okay. Here's an interesting question that just came in. Baseball canceled their minor leagues this year. Do you see the NBA canceling the G League?
I think teams are going to be utilizing the two-way players this year, so I think they'll probably want to keep the G League going. I thought I saw something that they were talking about doing a bubble for the G League, maybe, but I think they'll probably want to keep that going.
I think so too. If they need to tap into players, that's where they're going to get them.
Well,
Go ahead,
Ryan.
I would just say the challenge real quick for those who don't know is G League travel is not glamorous. It's buses and a lot of Southwest flights. So you think of logistical issues. Obviously, the teams fly private and charter flights, so you can obviously mitigate the spread to some extent, controlling the environment. If I'm a G League player, coach, executive, whatever, I'll be very hesitant to get on and off of a bunch of commercial flights in this environment. So I know the G League has thought about bubbles. Larry, you brought it up as a potential NBA schedule idea. For limiting the spread of the virus, it obviously makes sense. In the NBA, it's an option that they chose not to use. In the G League, I think it's going to be a necessity. I think they have to do that for most or all of the season. Do even mini pods or multiple pods or something like that, because otherwise, it's just the season won't work if the virus continues to spread like this.
Well, Larry, they have like the G League Ignite team, which is basically like the select team where they've had players go, instead of going to college, they're going to the G League. And that's like a big thing that the league is really positioning itself to be a part of, giving players an alternative to college. And to that just wash out in the first year of that can't happen. So I think the league, because of that, is going to make sure there's a G League season. What it looks like, I can't say. Calida mentioned the two-way players. The two-way players may end up spending most of the time with the parent franchise. But they're going to have a G League season of some sort for sure.
Yeah. All right. And we're getting a lot of questions. I'm just going to take a couple more because we are running behind. One question is, do you predict next year's salary, the 21-22 salary cap, will go up despite trying to make up for the loss of funds from this season? They thought of that. They built it in this year for 2021, they just hard set the cap. They're not basing it on the projected income like they do in a normal year. This year, they just say, we're going to peg it at what it was last year. And that's what they did back in 2011 with the last lockout. And in fact, in the 99 lockout prior to that, they just say, we know it's going to be a down year for revenue. We're not going to use projected revenues to set the cap. We're going to say it's right here where it was last year. So we know that it's going to be a normal year this year. And then for next year, the year after that in 2021, they're saying we're going to build in at least a 3% bump. And what that does, remember, many contracts were signed years before. So those contracts contain raises of 5% or 8% in many cases that are growing faster than revenues are, certainly. So what this does is it protects that, keeps it going up a little bit, and then they make up for it at the end of the season through escrow or through the shortfall payments. Any other things on that? Nobody else is commenting? All right, I'm going to take.
No, you're right.
I'm going to take one more. Will we see more teams straight up buying picks in the draft compared to prior drafts due to adjusted salary cap and COVID?
Wide range again. The same answer as before. Ryan talked a lot about the insecurity with medical records and how difficult this draft is. So I could see some teams saying, "I'm out. I don't want to touch it." You have a team like the Celtics who have an army of picks. They have 3 first-rounders. They basically have no roster space for all the players that they're going to have unless they draft guys who are going to play overseas. That they're looking to move out of those picks. Are there going to be buyers? And on the other side, it is cheap, relatively cheap labor for multiple years, right? You get a rookie scale contract in the 15 to 30 range. Those contracts are very reasonable. So if you could just land a rotation player and you're confident that you can get a rotation player, and if you don't have the medical information you want, but you're confident enough, then I think it's really going to be case by case, team by team. It's the Wild West. We're looking at chaos, and chaos is a ladder. They say, let's see who climbs in it and who falls to the bottom and really messes this up. It's going to be fun to see.
One additional thought there, Larry. There hasn't been a first-round pick sold in the NBA since 2013. The Denver Nuggets sold the 27th pick in the late first round to the Utah Jazz. That pick was used to select Rudy Gobert. So first, because it's not, that financially prudent generally to sell a pick for, $3 million or somewhere in that range. That's number one. But two, because of that specific example, every executive now looks at his owner and says, wait a minute, what if we sell a pick, you get cash, that's great. As an executive, I don't necessarily see that cash or get to use it, and then that guy or somebody drafted after him goes on to become really good. So my guess, even though times are tight, I'm guessing that you'll see that streak continue. Teams, as Eric mentioned, realize how valuable those first-round picks are, especially later in the round with the low salary slots. If you get a good contributor there, you're able to do a lot of other things roster-wise. So my guess is you'll see 0 first-round picks sold once again, but then in the second, a lot of picks. You mentioned Boston having 3 first-round picks. Philly has 4 second-round picks and a first. There's no way they can use 5 picks. We'll see some of those. They'll try to trade them if they can. If they can't trade them, they may sell them for cash.
Well, especially this year when teams haven't had a chance to vet all the prospects completely. So there really could be diamonds in the rough this year. I think picks are going to be especially valuable this year just because of all that variability.
Agreed.
All right. Well, I know we have other questions, but we are running late, so I'm going to wrap it up here. So that's it. Once again, remember to go to sportsbusinessclassroom.com, click on CBA Mastery to register in CBA Mastery with Larry Coon.
And there you have it. I hope you enjoyed the SBC Salary Cap webinar with Larry Coon, Eric Pincus, Ryan McDonough, and Calida Taylor. I know I did. You can find show notes for everything that was discussed, as well as links to follow the panelists at sportsbusinessclassroom.com/podcast. We'd love to hear your feedback on this episode and the show as a whole as well. If you've learned anything today, please don't hesitate to share this with your friends, colleagues, family, and anyone you think might be able to get something out of it. And if you really got a lot of value, please take a moment to rate and review the show wherever you're consuming it. And as always, we do this show for you. So if you have any comments or questions, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach out to us on Twitter at SportsBizClass, that's B-I-Z, or you can reach out to me personally at NBA Bo, that's B-E-A-U. Big thank you to our sponsors as well, SBC Online and Hall Pass Media. And thank you for listening. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you next week on another episode of the Sports Business Classroom audio experience.